Bright studio lights bathed the sleek, modern set of American perspectives tonight, casting sharp shadows against the polished glass table where two figures sat across from each other. The cameras were already rolling, the anticipation thick in the air. Millions of viewers had tuned in, eager to watch what was being marketed as a conversation on leadership and policy, though anyone familiar with these debates knew that the true battle would extend far beyond the stated topics. Caroline Leavitt exuded poise, her expression composed yet commanding. A rising figure in political circles, she had made a name for herself by speaking with unwavering conviction, her words carefully chosen but never hesitant. She was a master at navigating tough conversations, unshaken even in the most heated exchanges. Her ability to connect with the public had propelled her career forward at an astonishing speed, making her both a respected and polarizing figure. Tonight, she was here not just to defend her positions but to reaffirm the principles that defined her. Opposite her sat Alan Brooks, a veteran journalist whose reputation had been built on his ability to dismantle arguments with surgical precision. His interviews were known for their relentless pursuit of inconsistencies, exposing gaps in logic and forcing his guests into moments of discomfort. He was not a man easily impressed, nor one to hold back when an opportunity to challenge his opponent arose. The years had sharpened his instincts, making him a formidable force in any debate. His posture was relaxed, yet the sharp glint in his eyes betrayed his readiness to strike at the first sign of weakness. The set was designed to create an atmosphere of intellectual combat, subtle yet deliberate choices in lighting and camera angles heightened the sense of confrontation. The audience, seated just beyond the stage, was hushed with expectation. Some had come as supporters, others as skeptics, but all were waiting for the inevitable clash of ideas. Behind the scenes, producers monitored the live feed, prepared to amplify any moment of tension that could make headlines by morning. From the moment the program began, both participants played their roles flawlessly. Caroline spoke with a steady confidence, her words measured, her presence unshaken. She outlined her vision for leadership, emphasizing integrity, responsibility, and the moral compass that guided her decisions. Alan, in turn, dissected her statements with calculated precision, pressing her on policy specifics, historical precedents, and potential contradictions. It was the type of high-level political discourse the public had come to expect, an intricate game of verbal chess played between two masters of their craft. Yet, beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension. A shift in the air that only those attuned to these exchanges could recognize. Alan's questions became more pointed, his approach more direct. Caroline, unfazed, met each challenge head-on, her responses crisp and unwavering. But the energy in the room suggested that something deeper was at play. This was not just a routine political debate, it was a moment waiting to turn into something far more personal. In the control room, producers exchanged glances as Alan's body language subtly changed. He leaned in just slightly, his fingers tapping against the edge of his chair in a practiced rhythm. To the untrained eye, it was a small movement, but to those who had seen him in action before, it was the telltale sign that he was preparing to shift gears. The opening rounds of policy discussions had served their purpose, but now, Alan was ready to steer the conversation into new territory, one that could unravel his opponent or force her into a rare moment of vulnerability. Caroline, ever perceptive, registered the shift before Alan even spoke his next words. There was a slight pause, a nearly imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, though her expression remained unchanged. She had faced countless difficult questions in her career, but the way Alan was setting up his next move suggested this was going to be different. She could sense it, this was the moment where the debate would transcend the expected rhetoric and veer into something far more profound. The audience, picking up on the tension, sat a little straighter. Conversations in the control room quieted. Even the camera operators, usually immune to the ebb and flow of televised debates, felt the subtle charge in the air. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to define the night. And just like that, the stage was set for a conversation no one would forget. Alan Brooks had spent years perfecting his craft. He knew when to press, when to ease back, and when to set a trap so subtly that his opponent wouldn't even realize they had walked into it. The first 20 minutes of the debate had gone as expected, exchanges over economic policies, government regulations, and social structures, each candidate delivering carefully rehearsed responses. Caroline Leavitt, as always, had held her ground with impressive ease, countering his challenges with clarity and composure. But Alan wasn't interested in merely dissecting policies tonight. He had been waiting for the right moment to shift the conversation into something deeper, something that would push Caroline into unfamiliar territory. That moment had arrived. Adjusting his posture slightly, he let the briefest pause settle over the room, ensuring that the audience felt the weight of the shift before it even happened. His expression remained calm, his tone measured, but there was an unmistakable sharpness behind his words as he steered the discussion away from the well-trodden path of politics and into a far more contentious subject, faith. For Alan, the question of religion in leadership had always been a fascinating weak spot, a fault line that could crack even the most seasoned politicians. It was easy to defend policy decisions with statistics, historical trends, or economic models. Faith, however, was intangible, built on belief rather than data, emotion rather than proof. And in a world increasingly shaped by scientific advancements and technological progress, faith, to him, was an outdated relic, a comforting illusion people clung to when reason failed them. He framed his argument with precision, positioning himself as the voice of modern pragmatism. Religion, he suggested, was losing its grip on American society. The statistics were clear. Fewer people than ever identified with organized faith, more placed their trust in science and reason over ancient doctrines. And yet, here was Caroline Leavitt, a leader of the next generation, openly professing that faith guided her decision-making. How, he implied, could a modern leader justify basing public policy on something as subjective as personal belief? The audience was still, the weight of the question settling over them like a held breath. Some leaned forward in anticipation, others exchanged subtle glances, sensing that this was the moment the debate would take its most personal turn. Caroline didn't react immediately. She listened, absorbing the layers of his argument, her expression unwavering. Alan was playing a strategic game, one she had seen before. He wasn't just questioning her personal faith, he was challenging its relevance, its legitimacy in shaping the decisions of those in power. And more than that, he was attempting to push her into a defensive position, to force her to justify something that, by its very nature, defied justification in the empirical sense. She could feel the subtle energy shift in the room. The producers behind the cameras were poised, waiting for a misstep. The audience members who had come expecting a standard political sparring match were now holding their breath, sensing they were witnessing something much more profound. Alan, ever the tactician, continued to build his case, reinforcing the idea that faith was not just irrelevant but, in some ways, a hindrance to progress. He painted a picture of a world that had moved beyond religious dependence, a society that had outgrown the need for divine explanations. Science had provided answers to mysteries once attributed to the supernatural. Medicine had extended human life in ways that prayer never could. Technology had connected people across continents, eliminating the need for the spiritual bonds that had once held communities together. If the world was moving forward, why, he asked, though never directly, was Caroline still clinging to something that many considered a relic of the past? The tension in the studio deepened, the air thick with expectation. This was the kind of moment Alan thrived on, the kind that would dominate headlines and social media debates for days to come. He had set the perfect trap. Caroline could either double down on her faith, risking alienation from the more secular audience, or she could retreat into vague, non-committal rhetoric, weakening the very conviction that had made her such a compelling figure. Either way, Alan believed, he had backed her into a corner. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of her expression, the slightest shift in her body language. The audience, sensing they were witnessing a defining moment, was utterly silent. The country watched, waiting for her response. But what Alan had not accounted for, what he had failed to anticipate in his precise, calculated strategy, was that Caroline Leavitt had no intention of retreating. She was not one to be rattled, nor was she one to let her convictions be reduced to a political vulnerability. She had been preparing for this moment long before Alan had ever asked the question. As she took a measured breath, ready to answer, the entire room seemed to shift. The trap that had been so carefully set was about to be turned on the very man who had laid it. A hush settled over the studio. The weight of Alan's argument, so carefully constructed, hung in the air, waiting for Caroline's response. The audience, both in the room and at home, had seen countless politicians falter under this kind of pressure. This was where most would pivot, deflect, or lace their answers with vague, diplomatic phrasing designed to appease without truly engaging. But Caroline did none of those things. She took a measured breath, her expression remaining composed. There was no panic in her posture, no sign that Alan's words had unsettled her. Instead of rushing to defend herself, she allowed the silence to linger, giving the moment the weight it deserved. Then, when she finally spoke, it wasn't with rehearsed rhetoric or carefully crafted soundbites. It was with a story. 12 years ago, she had been fresh out of college, thrown into the world of politics with the same youthful certainty that so many ambitious newcomers carried. She believed, then, that policy was the most powerful force in the world, that logic and reason could solve the nation's problems if only applied correctly. Faith, to her at the time, had been something personal, something separate from the practicality of governance. It was an accessory, not a foundation. Then she met Margaret. Margaret had been 72 years old when Caroline first encountered her at a community outreach event. It was the kind of event that young political staffers attended without much thought, smiling at photo opportunities, shaking hands, nodding politely as constituents shared their concerns. Caroline had expected nothing more than an obligatory appearance. But Margaret changed that. She had a quiet presence, one that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. She was not a loud woman, nor was she particularly imposing, yet when she spoke, people listened. There was something in the way she carried herself, a kind of strength that came not from status or power but from something deeper, something unshakable. Margaret had suffered more than most could comprehend. She had buried 2 sons, one taken by cancer, the other by a drunk driver. She had lost her husband to a stroke, outlived her siblings, and watched as the world around her became increasingly unfamiliar. By all accounts, she should have been broken, consumed by grief. Yet, when she sat across from Caroline that day, she did not speak of loss with bitterness. She did not ask for sympathy. She smiled. Caroline had asked her how she did it, how she could endure so much devastation and still sit there, steady and warm, as if the weight of her past had not crushed her. The answer Margaret gave had stayed with Caroline ever since. Faith, Margaret had said, was not about proof or certainty. It was not about having all the answers or being able to justify every hardship. It was about standing when everything else tried to pull you down. It was about believing that, even when the world felt empty and cruel, there was still meaning to be found. She had not turned to faith because it was easy or because it provided a convenient explanation for suffering. She turned to it because, without it, she would have collapsed under the weight of her grief. That moment had changed something in Caroline. She had always thought of faith in the abstract, as something people held onto for tradition or comfort. But Margaret had shown her that faith was neither a weakness nor a crutch. It was survival. It was resilience. It was the thing that kept people moving forward when logic and reason had nothing left to offer. As Caroline recounted Margaret's story, the energy in the studio shifted. The audience, once expectant of a heated exchange, now sat in near silence. Even Alan, who had built a career on challenging beliefs with relentless scrutiny, did not immediately interject. The usual rhythm of debate had been broken, replaced by something far more human. Faith, Caroline made clear, was not about ignoring science or dismissing reason. It was not about forcing beliefs upon others or using religion as a tool for control. It was about how people endured the unimaginable. It was about what they turned to when every tangible solution failed them. Margaret had not expected life to be fair. She had not prayed for an existence free of suffering. She had simply chosen to believe that, even in her darkest moments, she was not alone. That belief had carried her through the unbearable. And that, Caroline concluded, was why faith still mattered. Not because it was provable or universally accepted, but because, for many, it was the only thing that kept them standing when nothing else could. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every expression in the room. The producers, who had anticipated a typical policy debate, now found themselves watching something far more compelling. Viewers at home, some skeptical, some indifferent, felt something shift in their perception, not necessarily about faith itself, but about the way it was often dismissed in discussions like these. Alan, for the first time that night, did not immediately counter. He adjusted his tie slightly, his fingers tapping once against the desk as he absorbed her words. He had expected statistics. He had expected theological justifications or historical references. But he had not expected this. The room, once filled with intellectual sparring, now held something far heavier. Something real. The weight of Caroline's words settled over the studio like a heavy fog, thick and undeniable. The controlled chaos of a televised debate, the carefully timed interruptions, the sharp rebuttals, the strategic shifts in tone, had vanished. In its place was a silence that carried more meaning than any argument could. Alan Brooks, a man who had spent decades refining his ability to dismantle arguments, suddenly found himself staring at a truth he hadn't expected. He had walked into this debate armed with statistics, with logical reasoning, with the unwavering confidence of someone who had forced countless public figures into uncomfortable corners. Yet now, all those tools felt insufficient. The audience, once buzzing with anticipation for the next verbal clash, had stilled. The usual murmurs, the subtle shifts in posture as people whispered their reactions, had ceased. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto Alan, waiting for his response. Not in the way they usually did, not as spectators eager for a winner to emerge, but as people who had just been confronted with something raw and unfiltered. For the first time in a long time, Alan wasn't sure what to say. His mind worked quickly, instinctively grasping for a way to reframe the conversation, to regain control. He considered shifting the discussion back to policy, steering away from the deeply personal place Caroline had taken it. He considered challenging her story, questioning its broader implications, reducing it to an emotional anecdote rather than a legitimate argument. But none of those tactics felt right. Not here. Not now. Something had changed. He exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the desk in a rhythmic motion, not out of impatience, but contemplation. The room around him had transformed. This was no longer just a debate. It was something more, something he couldn't quite define. Beyond the stage, the production team sat in stunned silence. The control room, normally filled with quiet discussions and real-time adjustments, was frozen. Even the camera operators, who had seen hundreds of debates play out under these same lights, sensed they were capturing something different. This wasn't just another night of television. This was a moment. Caroline remained poised, her expression unchanged, yet there was something in her eyes, an understanding of the shift that had just taken place. She had not aimed to win an argument. That had never been her goal. She had simply spoken the truth as she knew it, and in doing so, she had disrupted the entire rhythm of the debate. Alan recognized that now. This was no longer about winning or losing. It was about something deeper, something uncomfortable, something that defied the usual rules of engagement. The audience, still silent, carried a mix of expressions. Some looked contemplative, others visibly moved. A few wore the kind of look that only came when someone had been forced to rethink something they had long dismissed. There was no eruption of applause, no dramatic exclamations, just the collective stillness of people sitting with something they didn't quite know how to process. Alan shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, a small, almost subconscious action that betrayed his own discomfort. He had spent his career mastering the art of intellectual combat, but tonight, the battle had taken an unexpected turn. He had always prided himself on being the one asking the hard questions, the one exposing the inconsistencies in his opponent's beliefs. And yet, here he was, sitting across from someone who had done something far more effective than countering his points. She had bypassed the argument entirely and made him feel something. That was the part he hadn't anticipated. The weight of Margaret's story, of faith not as a weapon but as a lifeline, lingered in his mind. He had always viewed religion as a crutch, a tool used to justify outdated thinking, a force that too often stood in the way of progress. But Caroline had reframed it entirely. She had not argued for faith in the way most people did. She had not tried to prove it, to defend it with doctrine or historical precedent. Instead, she had painted a picture of what faith looked like in the darkest moments of a person's life. And what unsettled Alan the most, what gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, was that he had no rebuttal for that. Somewhere in the audience, a producer finally exhaled, breaking the stillness ever so slightly. A camera adjusted its angle, catching Alan's expression in a close-up that would later be dissected by commentators and viewers across the country. The moment was undeniable. Alan had not expected to be the one caught off guard. The moderators, sensing the delicate nature of what had just transpired, hesitated before interjecting. They had anticipated a high-energy exchange, something that would ignite partisan reactions across the board. Instead, they were witnessing something rare, a debate that had become human. Beyond the studio, social media was already alight with reactions. Clips of the moment were being uploaded in real time, accompanied by captions that ranged from analytical to emotional. Some framed it as a defining moment in political discourse, others simply as a reminder of something often lost in the noise of ideological battles, the power of a story that could not be argued away. Alan finally leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him as he gathered his thoughts. The moment stretched, unhurried, as if the usual time constraints of television had been temporarily forgotten. He had walked into this debate certain of how it would unfold. He had assumed that faith, when placed under the scrutiny of logic, would falter. That it could be debated, deconstructed, rendered obsolete. And yet, in this moment, with the entire room waiting for his response, Alan found himself confronted with a reality he had not accounted for. Faith was not an argument to be won or lost. It was an experience. And experiences, no matter how much one might try, could not simply be debated away. The debate ended, but its impact was only beginning. As the cameras cut and the studio lights dimmed, there was an unspoken understanding among everyone in the room that something significant had just taken place. Unlike the usual political clashes that trended online for a few hours before being buried under the next controversy, this moment refused to fade into the background. It lingered, pressing itself into the minds of those who had witnessed it. Alan Brooks removed his microphone with a quiet efficiency, his usual post-debate routine momentarily disrupted by a lingering sense of reflection. He had spent years controlling the narrative, shaping discussions to expose weaknesses and contradictions. But tonight had been different. Tonight, he had walked away not with a definitive conclusion, but with something far more unsettling, uncertainty. Caroline Leavitt, on the other hand, remained seated for a moment longer. She had expected the usual rush of reactions, the immediate dissection of her words across news networks and social media. But this was something else entirely. She could hear the quiet murmurs of the crew, see the way the audience members hesitated before leaving, as if reluctant to break the stillness that had settled over the room. This was not the kind of debate people simply moved on from. And she was right. Within hours, clips of the exchange flooded every major platform. But instead of the usual partisan reactions, something unusual was happening. The conversation was shifting. On social media, comments poured in, not just from the expected political circles, but from everyday people who had never engaged in these discussions before. Some admitted that, while they still didn't consider themselves religious, they had never heard faith explained in a way that wasn't about control or dogma. Others, who had long abandoned their beliefs, found themselves questioning whether they had truly let go, or if they had simply buried something they weren't ready to face. News segments dissected the moment, not with the usual bombastic declarations of victory or defeat, but with a rare sense of contemplation. Analysts replayed the debate, focusing not on the political implications, but on the shift in tone, the way an ideological argument had transformed into something deeply personal. Even late-night talk shows, which often thrived on ridiculing faith in public discourse, approached the discussion with an unexpected sincerity. It was Allen's response, however, that shocked people the most. Normally, he was the first to take control of the post-debate conversation, releasing carefully worded statements or appearing on follow-up segments to reinforce his points. This time, he did none of that. Instead, he remained silent for nearly an entire day, an eternity in the fast-moving world of media. And when he finally did speak, his words carried more weight than any sharp rebuttal he had delivered on air. He admitted, in a rare moment of honesty, that he had walked away from the debate with more questions than answers. That for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure how to categorize what had happened. He didn't declare himself a changed man, nor did he suddenly embrace the beliefs Caroline had defended. But he acknowledged that something about her story had stayed with him, lingering in a way that no argument ever had. That admission, brief as it was, set off another wave of discussions. Commentators, journalists, and viewers alike latched onto the idea that a seasoned skeptic like Alan Brooks could be moved, not converted, not persuaded in the traditional sense, but moved. And that, more than anything else, was what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't about proving one side right or wrong. It was about the undeniable fact that a story, told in the right way, had the power to make even the most rigid thinkers stop and reconsider. In the days that followed, the ripple effect only grew stronger. Emails flooded Caroline's inbox, not just from supporters, but from people who had never engaged with her before. Some shared their own experiences, stories of faith lost and found, of loved ones who had embodied the kind of resilience Margaret had represented. Others admitted that they had never truly understood what faith meant until now, not as a rulebook or a political stance, but as something deeply human. Even those who had spent their lives opposing religion found themselves reflecting in ways they hadn't anticipated. A well-known comedian, famous for his scathing critiques of faith, admitted on his podcast that while he still didn't believe, he had felt something during that debate, something he couldn't quite explain. A scientist with a massive online following tweeted that perhaps science and faith were not as incompatible as people had made them out to be. That maybe, just maybe, there was room for both. And then there were the quieter responses, the ones that never made headlines but were perhaps the most important of all. A woman who had stopped praying years ago, finding herself whispering a few hesitant words into the silence of her room. A man who had dismissed faith as weakness, remembering the words of a grandmother he had long since lost. A young person, struggling with grief, realizing they were not as alone as they had believed. Caroline, watching all of this unfold, understood something in a way she never had before. She had gone into that debate prepared for a battle of ideas. She had expected to defend, to counter, to prove her point. But in the end, it hadn't been a policy argument or a theological stance that had changed the conversation. It had been a story. A simple, human story that had reached people in a way facts and figures never could. And perhaps that was the real power of faith, not in its ability to persuade, but in its ability to connect. The moment eventually faded from the headlines, as all things do. The world moved on, new debates arose, and the cycle of discourse continued. But something had shifted. A seed had been planted, not in the political sphere, but in something far deeper. Because long after the debate was over, long after the cameras had turned off and the analysis had died down, people were still thinking about it. And that, more than anything, was proof that some stories never truly end.